Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session hosted by Appfire and Inmarsat. Today's title of the session is Escape the Admin Black Hole, How a Leading Satellite Provider Commands Its Atlassian Stack. My name is Tyler Wolstenhume. I'm an Enterprise Solutions Advisor at Appfire. I have been in the tech industry for about 10 years and have spent much of my career in tech and financial services focused on solution consulting. I'll turn the time over to Evan and Dan to introduce themselves.
Hey, my name is Evan Tomany. I'm a product evangelist here at Appfire. I've been in tech for almost 20 years, and about half of that has been working as an Atlassian administrator, mostly across the Jira and Confluence products.
Hi, I'm Dan Timms. I am an Atlassian architect for Inmarsat. I've kind of been in the Atlassian ecosystem for about 7 years or so now. The first 4 of those were actually at a solution partner, where I got trained as a consultant, got my ACPs, and kind of got all certified. But for the last 3 years, I've been at end users like Inmarsat, so end customers and things like that. So I've really been able to kind of see those challenges from both sides.
Incredible. Dan, thank you so much for being here. Evan, we appreciate you also co-hosting with us at Appfire. Super cool, Dan, that you've had both the consulting side and partner solution side. Great perspective to have in today's topics. A brief agenda. We're going to do a quick intro to Appfire and Inmarsat, as well as delving into common governance challenges and solutions, particularly vulnerability management, data retention, and policy adherence. And then we'll also wrap it up with a few takeaways. So I really like this particular tagline. I wish it were mine. It's something that we take very seriously at Appfire. We build leading solutions that propel work forward. And because when work flows, productivity flows. So what that really means is we provide tools for organizations that help them automate and help them augment their capability to work more efficiently. So when this happens, you spend time on the things that you're mostly interested in, which helps you become more productive as an employee. Quickly, at Appfire, we have been a partner since 2007. One of the largest ongoing partner providers in the Atlassian ecosystem. Very cool that we've been Partner of the Year a couple of times. And today at Appfire, we focus on a few different solutions, one of which is our ITSM solution. And we all know we're here for a workflow and automation solution as well. And then we focus a lot on helping organizations migrate and manage their Jira instances. So moving on to this particular slide, a lot of people trust Appfire for our security, as well as our ability to help you scale. Appfire is also super well known for our security in the cloud, as well as our reliability, support, and privacy standards, all of which are super interesting to organizations. And with that, we'll turn it over to Inmarsat and Dan for an intro.
Yeah, thank you. So Inmarsat is one of the world's leading satellite communications companies. We have some of the world's most sophisticated satellites ever made. We currently have a fleet of around 14 that are sat out in a geostationary orbit. With the latest, which was the I6F2, that was actually launched back in February on the back of a Falcon 9, which was really awesome to watch. And that was our most advanced satellite to date. We provide broadband and telecommunications all over the world, no matter where you are, air, sea, or land. You can always use Inmarsat. And during natural disasters and things, we'll always make sure that we are constantly moving our satellites around to make sure that the emergency services are never losing connection. So how do Inmarsat use Atlassian? We actually have 5 cloud sites, a DC, and a server we are still trying to figure out what to do with. But we have to do that based on kind of how the company is made up. We are kind of split into 5 major divisions, and that is based on regulatory requirements and kind of the markets that each of those divisions go for. So that's kind of, it made a lot of sense to make sure that we kept our Atlassian sites in line with how the company continued to run due to those regulatory requirements. Now, we also have some of our own standards, some of our own ISO standards that we live up to. And to make sure that we're always hitting our targets and being the absolute best teams that we can do, we have 3 internal teams that are always there to provide us the advice and the guidance that we need to make sure that we are keeping up to the standards that we say we will to our customers.
And that's incredible. It's super cool. I wish I was there to see the Falcon 9 launch. That's an awesome sight to see.
It's pretty cool.
Also super interesting. I find that, with my Jira instance, I don't launch satellites into space, and that's something that you get to do with your Jira instance. So that is really, really cool. And that leads us into our next slide here. So I want to, take everyone on a journey a little bit. As we're Jira administrators, we have a lot of controls and levers, much like someone who is launching a satellite into space or flying a spaceship. And so you're in control. You have a lot of control. And as you scale and your complexity intensify, the pull of that administrative black hole gets super strong. So how do you maintain control? One of the challenges that we'll delve into today is vulnerability management and how Inmarsat approached that. Here we have a quote by Rapid7. This is a super interesting one, and the wording is a little bit interesting here. We've seen a 71% decrease in the time it takes a bad actor to exploit that particular vulnerability. So that means that as organizations, we have also got to match that pace in resolving those and protecting ourselves. So, if a lot of parents out there, much like when a toddler, on that very moment when they learn to open their first cabinet, you guys remember that turning point. It drastically changes how secure your house needs to be, as well as in organizations. This is drastically changing how buttoned up that we need to be as well. So Dan, tell me a little bit more about how you've been dealing with vulnerability management.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges that kind of exist in the world of vulnerability management is actually around misaligned priorities. And what I mean by that is you will have usually like a central security team, a vulnerability team that will be triaging all these vulnerabilities, making sure that things are getting done, but they necessarily aren't the ones that actually go ahead and do that work. And what you then end up with is two sets of teams that will both have their own priorities, their own list of planned work and things like that. And then you've got to try and get them all on the same page and work into the same sort of deadlines. And it can be really challenging when you're dealing with things like that. Now, I know one of the biggest challenges, and I definitely want to get Evan in on this, is around, how do you kind of prioritize that effectively?
Yeah, so there's a reason we put prioritizing on the slide 3 times here. Prioritization really is the name of the game. And I often find that these resolver teams who are responsible for remediating these vulnerabilities, they don't care as much about the vulnerabilities because they're so focused on customer service. They want to be releasing new features, planning upgrades. They want to be doing things that their customers care about, and their customers don't care about vulnerabilities. Often, yeah. I think these teams think that vulnerabilities aren't important until they're exploited. But as you know, the security team isn't just going to wait and hope to see if something gets exploited, right?
Do you think that's more because the customers don't actually see the vulnerability themselves? So that it's kind of, I can't see it, I don't care. And then that's why
absolutely. Yeah, the vulnerabilities that get covered first are the ones that customers are most likely to see. The ones that are in the news, those high priority vulnerabilities, those we swarm around and we handle them quickly. But these medium and low priority vulnerabilities just get stuck in a backlog somewhere and we never think about them. So that's why it's so important to make sure we have a process that gets these vulnerabilities where the teams are, so the teams can work on them during their normal course of daily work.
Yeah, brilliant point. That's why it's got to be kind of one of these ongoing regular processes that your teams kind of do come together and understand why things are kind of where they need to be. Because I think if you do it once and you think it's just going to work, it's not. And that's another challenge the teams see.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you tell us a little bit more about the challenge specifically that you faced at Inmarsat?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a central security team that kind of help keep the Inmarsat world safe. They have multiple scanning tools that help them do that, things like CrowdStrike, etc. And the idea is that they were having to go into all of these different tools, look at what things are kind of being thrown up, and then go back to Jira to not only plan their actual planned work, but then help remediate all of these vulnerabilities that were coming into the world. So it was kind of a mess for that team in itself because they had lots of little places to work, but wanted to work in Jira. And the worst thing was the context switching, not only for them, but then when things got escalated to resolver teams themselves, they would have their own projects within Jira, but they were being asked to come out of their world, work in a different project with different processes, different requirements, and it was just creating this huge, heavy processes that kind of didn't really work. And the disruption, especially for some of our software teams, was incredible. And I mean, for those that have worked with software development teams, I'm pretty sure you'll all know that the one thing they absolutely despise is a disrupted sprint. So it was a real mess sometimes. So we did actually look for a solution. The first thing we did was we kind of moved their integrations. We integrated their external scanning tools and kind of pushed everything into Jira so that it was only one place for the team to look. And the next thing we actually turned to JMWE, so Jira Miscellaneous Workflow Extensions, to kind of handle the rest, which was how we better escalate those tickets that we need. And the first thing we did when we looked at kind of using JMWE is how many resolver teams, where they're going to sit, and how do we need to keep that kind of initial vulnerability ticket up to date. So that was our real big focus, because we needed to not derail teams, but also make sure that the security team felt comfortable that the work was being done. So we actually have got a demo of this. It isn't a demo environment because obviously we can't show you my production, but I want to walk through this for you now. So we have a vulnerability project that we've spun up, and as you can see, it's a work management project. Now, in theory, all of your external scanning tools, if they could integrate through native integrations, marketplace integrations, or just API, you would basically have them spit out tickets into this project, covering as much detail as you could. Now, of course, you always have that big blue button at the top where you can fill in a vulnerability, which we're doing right now. So, of course, you'd want to include as much information in here as possible. You'd want to make sure that this vulnerability ticket really kind of gives the team everything they need to go ahead and resolve it instantly. Now, once we're happy with the ticket, obviously the security team in this case would start triaging that work. So they would again go ahead and start reviewing it. Is all the information in there that's required? Have we got start dates? Have we got the right priority, the severity? And of course, the most important is providing that commentary so that we actually understand the true state of where this vulnerability is. Now, as you can see, Evan has actually gone ahead and looked, and he's filled in everything he can, but he now realizes we have to escalate this ticket. So he's selecting a component for Corp IT infrastructure and moving it to escalated. Now, what this is going to do in the background is actually go ahead and create a linked issue inside the Corp IT's project. So you can see here it's SIT21. So now that we go ahead, we can move into the Corp IT world. That will appear straight onto their board, so they can start managing how they need to. And as you can see, the team's decided to move straight into in progress and get on with it. Now, they themselves would want to make sure that we are, again, keeping things up to date with status changes, with comments, with any kind of other custom field data they need. And we obviously need to make sure that the security team are still aware of what's going on. So as you can see, we've actually gone ahead and created some stuff with JMWE to pass back those comments that are on the escalated ticket, as well as have an automated message to let the security team know that the team are working on it. Now, when that ticket is done, the corporate IT team all they have to do, again, is just move that ticket to done, maybe provide some additional commentary where required if things are wanting. And again, we can go back to the vulnerability ticket, and we can see that not only have we provided the commentary like last time, but we've also moved that ticket to done. All escalated tickets were resolved, so we can go ahead and close this. So what we actually did under the hood to make this work was use some shared actions. Now, the first one that you see here is about creating the ticket. So we can do some great things with smart values and some dynamic data here, where we can either just copy the data from the current issue into the newly linked issue, or we can go ahead and set variables using smart data, smart fields and smart values and things like that. And the second thing here is that you can see that we would display a message to the user to work. Now, the second shared action is actually around when things are being transitioned And that is to make sure that no matter where the ticket is being transitioned to, the same shared action is used, so the same message is always pushed. One of the last things we use is an event-based listener, so that any time an issue is commented on, we are again passing that message through directly to the vulnerability ticket to make sure that we are constantly keeping that central ticket up to date. And that way we always make sure there's a single source of truth. And finally, one of the last things that we always want to make sure is that we aren't closing tickets where maybe multiple escalated tickets are pushed out. So this validator makes sure that all escalated tickets are resolved before we go ahead and actually close the main vulnerability. Now, of course, in this day and age, we never want to stand still. We always want to find room for improvement. And so there are a few more things that we could actually do here. One of those is, again, continue to improve some of the direct user messaging that we provide with some of those shared actions to make sure that we keep users up to date of what's going on behind the scenes. That we may want to provide more context with some of the comments, because if you do have more escalated tickets, you want to make sure that you're tracking things in the right order. And finally is one of, requiring more fields. Make sure that severity level, urgency, that kind of stuff is also captured to improve some of that vulnerability management.
Dan, super interesting. I think one of my takeaways is, the security team is identifying these issues and getting them into Jira, but they're not ultimately responsible for fixing these issues. And so they're enabling the rest of your business partners to do these types of things. And they're using JMWE that allows them to save time, reduce errors as, they get these issues in front of the rest of your people. So super cool stuff. The second challenge that we'll cover is data retention. And we have a quote here by PwC. The interesting thing here is, I think what PwC is saying is that more now is not always better, right? I think in the past, we've really liked our data. We liked our big data sets, but now that is slowly changing. That concept is slowly changing. I think we're gravitating more towards what I like to call the 3 C's of data. And that's having clean data, current data, and compliant data. So if we're not compliant, that means that this is introducing risk into our organization. So I think that's something that's worth delving into. Evan, will you tell us a little bit more about your experience with this?
Yeah, absolutely, Tyler. I love those 3 C's. The first thing that I always mention when we're talking about data retention is legal discovery, because it's a thing that a lot of us don't really think about. As admins, we often think the more data, the better, right? That old adage. We often don't want to delete data because we're worried that customers will come back to us, that our users will come back to us and say, hey, I can't find this thing that I needed, right? But as our data balloons, the cost, if we ever get involved in litigation, if we ever get involved in compliance checks, the cost of going through massive amounts of data can be really high. I was at a company where we had a 6-figure bill for legal discovery for a single instance of litigation. So it's really important that we keep our data, honestly, as lean as possible to avoid that kind of thing. It also becomes a vulnerability issue. The more data that you have, the more potential there is for issues with vulnerability management. The other thing is that companies often think first about their communication platforms, email, Slack, Microsoft Teams, but they overlook things like Jira and Confluence, which, especially with attachments, can become very large stores of data. Dan, I'm sure that you've run into this too.
Too many times, unfortunately. And I think where we don't sometimes want to do that clean out, we don't recognize maybe the importance, the level of importance we give it. We may always be aware, but necessarily don't provide the importance and the time that we should. Now, what will often happen, especially from my experience, is that teams will put it off until it becomes too late. Now they've got so much data that actually their search performance starts to get affected, so things take longer to load, or the actual experience with the search isn't as good because now they've started to get duplications because people can't find things. And as humans, we are inherently lazy. We will always find the shortest route to the resolution as possible. And unfortunately, that is just the world that we live in. So I think, we need to make sure that we keep our user experience as best as possible, because the more we balloon the searches, the more that gets kind of worse. The easier it is for people to start making duplicated data. Now you have 2 sets of maybe processes and policies. which is very quickly going to lead to malpractice because people don't know which one to follow.
Yeah, absolutely. The other caution that I'll give with data retention is always involve your legal team, because especially when you start talking about regulatory compliance, there's going to be regulations that require you to remove data, but there's also going to be regulations that require you to keep data. So make sure that you've got that team involved in all of your decision making.
Yeah.
Dan, can we dive into the specifics of what Inmarsat was dealing with?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had, in terms of like our Atlassian world, like a lot of you, we have hundreds and hundreds of active spaces and projects within our kind of Jira and Confluence. Now, as well as having hundreds of active, we had at least 3 times that in inactive things that hadn't been modified, hadn't been viewed, that kind of stuff. And it was a mess, as you can probably expect. So we had hundreds of these things that we knew that we needed to clean out. Now, at the time, we did have a process, but it was manual. So it took a lot of time and a lot of effort for our admins to constantly keep on top of, and it was a huge headache. But we knew the target, we knew that we needed to improve search performance, we knew that we needed to get this back under control. But one of those things that we also needed to bear in mind, as Evan just called out, was that we needed to provide visibility of any changes that we were doing. We didn't want to delete data that was required, so we had to keep teams informed of while we were doing that. So one of the things that we did was actually turn to Power Scripts to handle this for us and in an automated fashion. So we basically took our current manual processor and looked at Power Scripts and the power it could offer and automated it. So what Power Scripts would do is on a monthly review basis, we'll go through our applications, look at the data and put it into 3 buckets, which was current, notified, and archived. Now, what would happen is obviously different actions at certain points. If it was current, it just left it alone. If it was notified, it would actually go ahead and look to the project leads or things like that to let them know and ask them if it's still relevant. If they didn't get a response, then of course that we could go ahead and archive that data. That way it was kept away, search results were better and things like that. Now, Evan, I believe you've got a demo for us to kind of see that.
Yeah. So I put together a simplified version of what Inmarsat has done. I'm going to start by showing you just all the projects here. Multiply this tenfold for what Inmarsat was dealing with. But I'm showing you this because at the end, we'll come back to this and show you how many projects are left. So to begin with, I'm going to switch over to the admin console here and show you what the script itself looks like. The script is going to iterate through all the projects that we have. And like Dan said, split them up into 3 categories. So here's the script. It's written in a language called SIL, which stands for Simple Issue Language. I won't get into it today, but feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Now, this script is looking at every project in our instance, and it's determining the last modified date of any issue in the project. And then you can see exactly what the script is doing here. It's archiving projects, it's notifying team leads for projects that fall into that category, and then it's leaving the rest of them alone. So for that notification, in this script, we're notifying via email, and we can customize that email to anything that you'd like. So this is one example of what an email can look like. You can see we said the project's getting dusty. You can customize anything you'd like in that notification with as much information as you wanted, including information from the project itself. Now, we ran that script from the admin console. Only the admins can access this, but we can also put the SIL scripts gadget on a dashboard in Jira so that end users could select a script and run it themselves. And you can see if we run from here, the script is going to do the exact same thing. It's the same script that's running in the background, but the user doesn't have the ability to edit it. Now, in this case, like Dan mentioned, we actually just want to schedule this. You can click schedule job here, and you can see we have a lot of options. In our case, we wanted to schedule it once a month, but it's possible to schedule this at any interval that you want. You can have it run every hour if you want. I think that might get a little bit annoying. If we pop back to projects here, you can see this is a much cleaner instance, and we're only working with current projects now. So there's a bunch more that we could be doing here. This product is incredibly powerful. We're informing via email right now, but we could also inform via Microsoft Teams or Slack. We only have 3 categories, but we could add more advanced logic, create lots of different categories. We could even delete projects if we wanted to. We could do the same thing for Confluence spaces, write a script in Confluence that goes through those spaces. We could do a similar script for inactive users, for example. Really, the sky's the limit. The space is the limit, I guess.
Evan, that was great. Thank you so much for sharing. I think this is just one example of how Power Scripts can make our lives better, and certainly did so in Inmarsat's case. I think one of the things, and I think I've heard you say this before, Evan, is if you can imagine it, then you can pretty much do it in Power Scripts. So I really like that.
That's definitely true.
That brings us to our final challenge, which is policy adherence. And when we say policy, I know this is everyone's favorite topic because policies are just awesome. We're referring to a set of guidelines that ensure that an organization's data and information assets are managed consistently and used properly and by the right people. So let's go ahead and look at this particular quote by GlobalScape. Now, this particular $4 million figure is just the start. I'm a brand guy at heart, so this could be $4 million plus damage to your brand reputation. It could also prevent you from building better tools or having to obtain other things that you would need this money to buy. So I think, Evan, you've spent a lot of time dealing with this particular topic. What insights do you have to share with us?
Yeah, I think everyone who's worked in IT has dealt with this topic. Policies are so important. They're important for every company, but I would say they're most important for companies that have particular regulatory requirements, especially if you have multiple regulatory requirements. You might be SOC certified, you might have to be SOX compliant, you might have to be HIPAA or GDPR compliant. There's so many regulatory compliance requirements, and in many cases, they're conflicting requirements. So you have to figure out how to manage those alongside each other. But regulatory compliance is only one reason to have to work within compliance requirements. There's also a reputation gain. So if you have two companies that make similar products, but one of them is SOC 2 certified, that company is often going to do a lot better in comparisons. So there's the ones that we're forced legally to abide by, and then there's the ones that we choose to for reputation reasons. Dan, I know that Inmarsat has, 12 different regulatory requirements you have to deal with?
Certainly enough, yeah, certainly enough.
So one of the things that we don't think about often with policies is creating a secure environment, because we have these policies around how to give people access to things, but we also have to think about policies with how we store and how we share data. We were just talking about data retention. We need to have policies, not just around data retention, but around the actual storing and sharing of all of that data.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenge that, like you said, every business will struggle with. Now, you might have kind of varying degrees of how kind of varying degrees of security around that data you just mentioned that you're trying to store. Some will be very specific in terms of maybe the data residency of where you need to adhere to, or you may just choose to kind of even be more specific. Things maybe have to be local. You may have to have, certain levels of backups and things like that. I think one of the challenges that every team will also struggle with around policy adherence, again, is around kind of making sure that data is current. Going back to kind of the last one about data retention as well, these two kind of do go really hand in hand. Current, compliant, and clear. We need to keep everything in line. And again, I think duplicated data makes that worse. It's worse because it makes it harder to follow the policies and processes you're putting in place.
It needs to be super clear which policy is current and which one has been approved and which one I should be reading.
Exactly. And then if you're storing things like a lot of teams are nowadays, that are working in Confluence day to day to do their work, if you're also storing your processes in there, we all know how easy it is with Confluence to make pages. So you can imagine how quickly it is to also make a duplicate page and therefore making the problem worse. So it's never not a nightmare.
Especially when you're working on a draft and you create a copy of a policy, but then you accidentally make that visible to everyone. Yeah, we've all been there. Tell me a little bit more. This is the last time I'll say this today about how Inmarsat has dealt with this.
We have lots and lots of teams in Jira and Confluence. They all have their own review processes in terms of how often things need to be reviewed and stuff like that. And a lot of these teams, again, were storing their processes and policies alongside their actual day-to-day work. So it was a challenge because we needed to make sure that we were selecting which pages needed certain review periods. And again, it was just getting a bit of a mess to kind of audit. That was, we have to, as part of our requirements, we need to make sure that we can provide a complete audit trail of any time these processes and policies are being changed. So it was a bit of a mess. Now, we looked at Kamala document management to handle this with us, and that enabled us to provide these workflow-like automations and approval steps to our documentation, which is something that is so needed in kind of today's world, especially when you're dealing with some of the requirements that we have. Now, that system allowed us to get the approval steps and the notifications that we needed to those approvers, to peer reviewers, to managers, and things like that. It allowed us to make sure that things were e-signatured and to, again, provide a better audit trail and kind of sign off that things had been agreed and that we were okay to go ahead and use those. But like I said, the biggest one was the audit trailing. We were able to take those reports, provide them to the governing bodies if required, and it just gave us that real kind of sense that we were being taken care of and things were properly being managed. So again, Evan, I think we have a small demo.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to caution, I have simplified this a lot. I know Inmarsat's workflow is quite long. I've made it a lot simpler in this case. So we just have 2 approval steps. So to begin with, this space has a workflow applied to every page in the space. So if I give this page a title and publish it, you'll notice that it automatically shows up in the draft status. You can see the status right under the name there. You can see that it's in draft. This means that it's not visible to end users yet. It's only visible to approvers. So it's ready for review. So we're going to enter ready for review for team review here and submit, and it will automatically gain a set of reviewers. Now, these are built into the workflow. There's a group that it adds, but I can edit them if necessary. I can add additional people or remove people here if I need to. Again, this is defined in the workflow that I'm allowed to edit these approvers. So there's 3 people who need to review this document. So we're going to skip to the 3rd one. It's been approved by the first 2. This workflow does require that everyone approve it. So the 3rd person approves it, says ready for manager review. And as soon as she clicks approve, it moves to the manager. Now, if we click on the manager here, you're going to see that you can't actually change anything. Again, this is locked in the workflow itself so that this manager has to review every document. You'll also notice that there's an email and a token field here. This is our e-signature feature. This token field can be generated by any 2FA application. The manager would set this up in his own profile so that he could generate a token every time he was required to e-sign something. And this is for regulatory requirements. Many regulatory requirements require e-signature verification. So as he enters an email address and token here, we've hidden the email address. Come to me if you have questions. Don't bother our friend. It's going to enter his token and hit approve. And as soon as this is approved by the manager, the status will become published and this document can be seen by everybody. You'll also notice that there's a 1-year expiration date on this article. So that means 1 year from the date that it was reviewed, it needs to be reviewed again. This allows you to meet whatever regulatory requirements you have. So now I'm going to show you the audit trail. So if we click on the 3 dots in the upper right-hand corner of this article, there's going to be document activity. And this shows any activity that's involved with a workflow. It shows every step in the workflow, every person that approved it, the notes that they added, whether it was a simple click-through approve or whether it was an e-signature approval requiring a token. If we go back to the space level, we can click on the document report over here on the left, and this shows a similar log of everything in this space. So this shows every page, the status, the last page update, It even shows you the expiration date if you have one. And you can sort this by any of these criteria to easily find any document in any status in this space. So Dan, like I mentioned, this is a much simpler version of the workflow that Inmarsat is using. And I know that Inmarsat has a whole bunch of different workflows that you're actually using. So this is just one example. There's obviously more that we could be doing here. We have some macros that you can add to the page itself to show the current workflow status, the assignees, the update dates, all that. In this case, we are sending notifications to the approvers. There's a bunch of ways we can customize that. We can customize email notifications. We can set notifications for expiration date. We can send notifications to people that a document has been approved and they actually need to read it. There's very advanced workflows that we can build using JSON workflows.
Evan, thanks so much for sharing that with us today. I think it's super important to have a document management process, and clearly Kamala Document Management provides some of those features that we all need to stay in compliance. So I appreciate you guys sharing those thoughts with us, and feel free as I go through the next slides to share your thoughts as well. A few takeaways for today: automate your way to space. I guess really interesting compared to the theme that we have today. Make sure that you build with scalability in mind. I think for me, this is the best takeaway. And I think it ties to number one. As you automate, make sure that you're doing that with the future in mind as you're solving those problems that you're really focused on today.
That's a huge point there. Yeah. Dan tells me this all the time. He tells me, think about yourself a year from now. When you're automating something, make sure that you're doing something that your 1 year from now self will appreciate.
Yeah, I mean, no one ever wants to have to rework, do things twice. Your future self will never thank you for that. I think one of the things to also bear in mind is your platforms at the moment are only ever going to grow, right? Realistically, the more Atlassian grows, the more companies and more teams want to use it. So your automations will continue to grow with them. And if you don't build with that scale in mind, we want to push automation. Obviously, we don't want to not automate things and do things manually, but you have to bear in mind how you're building them. You don't want to waste time. You don't want to make things full of more technical debt and make it harder for you to manage in the future.
Oh, that's awesome, Dan. And Inmarsat and Dan are my inspiration. Going back to the, launching satellites into space mentality, this is your spaceship. And your policies and your standards are basically the command center of that spaceship. And then the apps and integrations, like JMWE, Power Scripts, those are the things that help you drive it and successfully make those launches into space. So a little bit more about what we talked about. Fine-grained controls of Jira workflows, that's JMWE. Power Scripts, this is an extremely powerful tool that we have at Appfire for handling those complex process controls, as well as managing that UI. You can oftentimes alter that UI and help your users use it in the proper way. Lastly, we talked a little bit about Kamala Document Management, ensuring that the right people, can see those documents and that you're in compliance. Remember those 3 C's: current, compliant, and clean data. This will help you get there. So we really appreciate you joining us. Dan, again, thank you so much for being here. Evan, you're great. Appreciate those demos. And we're super happy to have you guys with us.